Hi everyone, and welcome back to BL's Story of Us. Before we begin, you might notice things look a little different. As I mentioned in my community post, moving forward, I'll be sharing more of my creative process with you. So while you listen, you'll be seeing a bit of the behind the scenes, where I create, edit, and build these stories. The main focus is still the story, and it will continue to be narrated by our male narrator. I really hope you enjoy this new experience. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what you think about the story. It helps more than you know. Now, get comfortable. Let's get into the story.
Part 1: The Sommelier's Trap. The Architecture of Silence. The Obsidian Room did not look like the headquarters of a criminal syndicate. It looked, by design, like the sort of place where morality was checked at the door along with the coats. Located 3 stories beneath the pavement of West London, the air was cool, filtered, and smelled faintly of expensive leather and dry ice. There was no smoke here, no chaos. The walls were lined with black acoustical panels that swallowed sound, turning every conversation into a conspiracy. Chris Bridge stood behind the mahogany bar, polishing a crystal Pinot Noir glass. He was 28, though his eyes looked older. He was an Omega, though most of the London underworld believed the Ghost, the head of the Westside syndicate, was an alpha of monstrous proportions. Chris preferred it that way. In a world run by posturing wolves, being a shark beneath the surface was a tactical advantage. He held the glass up to the dim amber light. Perfect. Not a smudge. "He's at the perimeter," a voice murmured in his earpiece. It was Kevin, his head of security. 3 SUVs, 6 guards. He's making a show of it. Chris didn't look up. Let him. Arrogance is heavy armor. It makes them slow. He thinks he's coming to buy us out, boss. I know what he thinks, Kevin. That's why he's walking into a room with only one exit. Chris set the glass down with a soft clink. Status on his detail? The wire transfer cleared 5 minutes ago. His men are ours. They just haven't told him yet. Good. Hold position. Chris adjusted his cuffs. He was not wearing the tailored Italian suits he usually favored during board meetings. Tonight, he wore the stark, crisp uniform of a sommelier. A black apron over a white shirt, a silver taste vin hanging on a chain around his neck. To the untrained eye, he was service staff. Invisible. Prop in the room. David Sadler, the Don of the East End, was coming to negotiate the surrender of the Westside territory. He believed the Westside was crumbling, leaderless, and desperate for a merger. He believed he was coming to pick the carcass of a dying organization. Chris checked the label of the bottle resting on the counter. A 1945 Romani Conti. It was worth more than the average London flat. It was bait. "Open the doors," Chris whispered. The wolf at the door. David Sadler did not walk, he prowled. He was a man who took up space as if it were his birthright. Broad-shouldered, 6'3", dressed in a charcoal suit that cost enough to feed a family for a year. He had the kind of face that stopped traffic, sharp jaw, dark stubble, and eyes the color of burnt iron. He radiated the heavy, pressurized atmosphere of a prime alpha. Usually, when an alpha of his status entered a room, the air grew thick. Lesser designations would flinch or step back, an instinctual reaction to the sheer commanding force of his presence. But the Obsidian Room remained quiet. The few patrons scattered at the tables, all Chris's plants, didn't look up. David stopped in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the shadows. He looked annoyed. "Empty?" David scoffed, his voice a deep baritone that carried easily across the silence. He turned to his advisor, a nervous beta named Mark. "I thought this place was the jewel of the West." "It is, sir," Mark stammered. "It's exclusive. It's a mausoleum," David corrected. "Where is he? Where is the ghost?" "The invitation said to be seated, sir. The proprietor prefers privacy." David laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Privacy, that's code for fear. He knows I'm here to buy his life, not just his business." Chris watched from the shadows of the bar, his face a mask of professional indifference. He studied David like an entomologist studies a beetle. He noted the way David kept his right hand free, near his hip. He noted the tension in his shoulders. David was dangerous, yes. He was a brawler who had fought his way to the top of the East End. But he was also loud. David signaled to his guards, 6 men who fanned out along the walls. These were the men Chris had purchased for £2 million less than an hour ago. They stood stoically, their loyalty already transferred, waiting for the signal. David and Mark sat at the center table, a circular booth illuminated by a single spotlight. It was theatrical. It was a stage. Chris picked up the wine list and the water pitcher. He walked across the floor. His footsteps were silent. He moved with the fluid grace that some might call feline, but was actually predatory efficiency. He arrived at the table and bowed his head slightly. Not a bow of submission, but a bow of service. "Good evening, gentlemen," Chris said. His voice was soft, modulated to be pleasant and forgettable. "Welcome to the Obsidian. May I start you with water while you wait for your host?" David didn't even look at him. He was busy checking his watch. "Sparkling. And make it quick. I don't like waiting." "Of course, sir." Chris poured the water. He could smell David now. It wasn't the musk described in cheap novels. It was the scent of expensive scotch, gunpowder, and the distinct, metallic tang of aggression. It was a headache in a suit. David finally glanced up. His eyes swept over Chris, from the name tag that simply read staff to the apron down to the shoes and back up. It was a dismissal. To David, Chris was furniture. "You," David said, snapping his fingers. "Does the ghost actually exist? Or am I waiting for a conference call?" "The proprietor will be with you shortly, sir," Chris replied, his face blank. David leaned back, stretching his arm over the back of the booth. He looked at Mark and smirked. Then he looked back at Chris. A cruel glint entered his eyes. He wanted to assert dominance. He wanted to mark his territory before the negotiations even began. "Tell me, sunshine," David said, his voice dropping lower. "Do you know wine? Or do you just carry the tray?" "I am the sommelier, sir." "Right, sommelier." David chuckled. "Let's test the cellar, then. If I'm buying this place, I want to know if the stock is vinegar." David leaned forward, his expression mocking. He switched languages. But he didn't switch to French or Italian. He switched to Flash, an archaic, bastardized mix of thieves' cant and 19th century East End street slang. He used it loosely, not bothering with the precise grammar of the old families, confident that the waiter wouldn't know the difference between a threat and a toast. It was a dialect used by the oldest crime families to discuss business in front of the police or the public. It was a code of violence, used to exclude outsiders and mark one's status as a true gangster. "Get the gargle for the mugs, boy," David sneered, the harsh, clipped vowels slicing through the air. "Top shelf lush. None of that rotgut swill you pedal to the marks. And look sharp, or I'll have your glims for buttons." Mark, the advisor, looked uncomfortable. He knew David was being unnecessarily cruel, using the secret language of the bosses to confuse a waiter. David waited for the confusion. He waited for the waiter to stammer, to ask, "Excuse me, sir?" He waited for the satisfaction of explaining, patronizingly, that he wanted a bottle of wine. Chris stood perfectly still. Inside, he didn't feel humiliation. He felt a cold, dry amusement. It was the feeling of a grandmaster watching a novice move a pawn into the line of fire. Chris didn't blink. He didn't ask for clarification. "Very good, sir," Chris said in standard English, his tone polite. David laughed again, turning to Mark. "See? He's nodding like a dog. He has no idea what I just said. He's probably going to bring me the house red." Chris turned on his heel and walked back to the bar. The vintage betrayal. Chris returned 3 minutes later. He carried a silver tray. On it sat the bottle of 1945 Romanée-Conti and 3 crystal glasses. He set the tray down with the precision of a surgeon. He presented the label to David. David's eyebrows shot up. He recognized the bottle. He knew the price. He looked at the waiter with a flicker of confusion. Chris produced a corkscrew. With swift, economical movements, he cut the foil and drove the worm into the cork. He didn't look at the bottle. He looked directly at David. "The 1945, Chris said. But he didn't speak in the service voice anymore. And he didn't speak in standard English. He spoke in the King's English, the Oxford-educated, clipped, aristocratic tone of the House of Lords. It was the voice of old money, of high academia, of absolute crushing authority. An aggressive choice, Chris continued, considering the circumstances. He pulled the cork with a soft pop. "However," Chris said, pouring a small amount into the tasting glass and swirling it, "I feel compelled to correct your syntax." David froze. The smile vanished from his face. "Excuse me?" Chris set the bottle down and clasped his hands behind his back. He looked down at David, his posture shifting. He no longer looked like a servant. He looked like a statue made of ice and judgment. "You attempted to use the East End cant," Chris said, his voice smooth and cold as a blade. "Specifically, the 1890s dialect of the dockyards. A charming, if rustic, attempt at intimidation." The room seemed to get colder. Mark stopped breathing. "But your vocabulary is flawed," Chris continued, his eyes boring into David's. "You used the word gargle. In the dialect, gargle refers specifically to cheap gin consumed by beggars. Yet you asked for a vintage wine. It's a linguistic contradiction. You also threatened to take my glims, my eyes, for buttons. But the correct pronunciation is gleams, unless you are implying you are from the uneducated Southwark slums." David slowly stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. His face was flushing a dark, angry red. The shock was turning into rage. "Who the hell do you think you are?" David growled. "You're a waiter. Watch your mouth before I—" "And finally," Chris interrupted, stepping closer rather than backing away, "you assumed I would not understand you because I am wearing an apron, which brings us to your most fatal error." Chris picked up the glass of Romanée-Conti. He didn't offer it to David. He took a sip himself. "You assumed you were the only predator in the room." David's hand went to his hip, reaching for the gun tucked into his holster. "I don't know who you are, Omega, but you just made a very short, very bad career choice." "My name," Chris said calmly, setting the glass down, "is Chris Bridge, but you know me as the Ghost." David paused, his hand on his gun. His eyes widened. You're the Don? You're a barely experienced Omega. I am the man who owns the floor you are standing on." "You're a joke," David spat. He drew his gun. It was a smooth motion, practiced and lethal. He leveled it at Chris's chest. "Joke's over. Get on your knees. Now." Chris didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply looked at David with a look of profound disappointment. "Mark," David barked, not taking his eyes off Chris. "Call the boys. We're taking this place apart. Start with him." Mark didn't move. "Mark." "He can't help you," Chris said. "And your gun is useless." "I have 6 men in this room," David snarled. "And a bullet with your name on it. On your knees." Chris sighed. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Simultaneously, 6 safety catches clicked off. David froze. The sound hadn't come from his side. It had come from behind him. He slowly turned his head. His own bodyguards, his personal detail, men he had paid, men he had trusted for years, had their weapons drawn. But they weren't aiming at Chris. They were aiming at David. "What is this?" David whispered, the color draining from his face. "Boys, put the guns down. Point them at him." The head guard, a man named Raki, didn't waver. "Sorry, boss. New management." David looked back at Chris, betrayal warring with confusion in his eyes. You turned my men?" "I bought them," Chris corrected. 20 minutes before you arrived. Everyone has a price, David. Yours was surprisingly affordable. Your payroll was late last month. Did you think they wouldn't notice?" David stood alone in the center of the circle of gun barrels. The power dynamic had flipped so violently it caused vertigo. A minute ago, he was the alpha king in a room of servants. Now he was a target. "You can't do this," David hissed, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "If you kill me, the East End burns. My lieutenant will come for you." Chris walked around the table. He moved into David's personal space. The height difference was significant. David towered over him, but Chris carried himself with such terrifying gravity that he seemed to look down on the alpha. "Sullivan?" Chris asked softly. "Your lieutenant?" David narrowed his eyes. "He'll raise this place to the ground." Chris pulled a tablet from his apron pocket. He tapped the screen and held it up for David to see. It was a recording, a grainy video from a security camera in a warehouse. It showed Sullivan, David's right-hand man, shaking hands with a rival boss from the north. Audio crackled through the tablet speakers. "The hit is set for tonight." Sullivan's voice was unmistakable. "David goes to the Obsidian to flex. He won't walk out. I take the chair by morning." David stared at the screen. The world tilted on its axis. The betrayal wasn't Chris's. It was his own brother-in-arms. "He sold you," Chris said, lowering the tablet. "He knew you were coming here. He didn't expect you to buy me out. He expected you to die here. If I hadn't bought your guards, Raki would have put a bullet in the back of your head the moment you sat down. Sullivan paid them to do it." David looked at Raki. The guard didn't deny it. He just kept the gun leveled. "I didn't turn them against you, David," Chris said calmly. "I outbid Sullivan to keep you alive." David lowered his gun slowly. His hand was shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a worldview shattering. "Why?" "Because Sullivan is chaotic," Chris said, turning away and walking back to the bar. "He's a wild card, bad for business. You, on the other hand, are predictable. I prefer a predictable enemy to a chaotic neighbor." "So what now?" David asked, his voice rough. "I walk out of here? Go kill Sullivan." Chris laughed. It was a soft, dry sound. "No. If you walk out that door, Sullivan's sniper across the street kills you. Or the police pick you up on the tip Sullivan planted." Chris pressed a button under the bar. The steel shutters over the entrance slammed down with a resounding clang, sealing the room. "You are dead to the world, David," Chris said. "As of this moment, you are missing. Presumed killed. You're kidnapping me. I'm sequestering you." Chris gestured to Kevin, his head of security. "Disarm him. Take his phone. Take his watch. Anything with a tracker." Two guards moved in. David tensed, his instincts screaming at him to fight. "Don't," Chris warned, his voice sharp. "You are an alpha in a room full of guns. You can die fighting for your ego, or you can live to reclaim your throne. Choose." David looked at the guards, then at Chris. He saw the cold calculation in the Omega's eyes. This wasn't a game. This was a chessboard, and he was a piece being moved to safety against his will. Slowly, reluctantly, David placed his gun on the table. He unclasped his Rolex. He handed over his phone. "Smart boy," Chris murmured. "I'm going to kill you for this," David whispered, though the threat felt hollow even to him. "When I get out, I'm going to." "When you get out," Chris interrupted, "it will be because I opened the door. Until then, you are a guest of the Westside Syndicate." Chris picked up the bottle of Romanicanti. "Take him to the penthouse. Lock it down. Level 4 protocols. No internet. No outgoing lines." The guards grabbed David's arms. He didn't struggle, but he glared at Chris with enough hate to burn a hole through steel. "You're making a mistake, Ghost." David spat as they dragged him toward the service elevator. "You can't keep a shark in a fishbowl." Chris watched him go. He waited until the elevator doors slid shut, hiding David's furious face. Only then did Chris allow himself to relax. He poured the wine into 2 glasses. He picked one up and took a slow, deliberate sip. "I'm not the fish, David," he whispered to the empty room. "I'm the tank, the glass cage." The elevator ride was silent and short. When the doors opened, David was shoved, literally shoved, into a hallway that smelled of expensive linen and rain. "Move," Raki said. The guard who had served him for 5 years now looked at him like a stranger. David stumbled forward into the main room. It was a penthouse suite, spanning the entire top floor of the building. Floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass looked out over the London skyline, rain streaking the panes like tears. The decor was minimalist, cold, and monochromatic. Black leather, chrome, gray slate. It was luxurious, and it was a prison. "Door," Kevin ordered. The heavy steel security door slammed shut behind David. He heard the distinct thud-click whir of triple-bolt electronic locks engaging. David stood alone in the center of the room. He spun around, checking the exits. None. The elevator required a keycard. The windows were sealed. The fire escape was likely alarmed and guarded. He let out a roar of frustration, grabbing a heavy abstract sculpture from a side table and hurling it across the room. It smashed against the wall, shattering into pieces. "Feel better." The voice came from everywhere. Speakers hidden in the ceiling. David looked up, scanning for cameras. He found them, tiny black domes in the corners. "Show yourself," David yelled at the ceiling. "Coward." A section of the wall shimmered, a large screen coming to life. It showed a live feed of the Obsidian Room below. Chris was sitting at the bar, reading a book. He wasn't even looking at the camera. The sculpture was a replica. Chris's voice filtered through the speakers, calm and unimpressed. "But if you break the furniture, you will sleep on the floor. I am not your maid." "Let me out," David growled, walking up to the screen as if he could intimidate the digital image. "I don't need your protection. I can handle Sullivan." "With what army?" Chris asked, turning a page. "Your men are mine. Your accounts are likely being frozen by Sullivan as we speak. You have no gun, no phone, and no friends. You are effectively a ghost, David. Welcome to the club. Why didn't you just kill me?" David slammed his hand against the wall. "If I'm such a liability. I told you. Stability." Chris finally looked up at the camera. His eyes were startlingly blue on the screen, cool and detached. "Sullivan is a butcher. If he takes the East, he starts a war with the North. The crossfire hurts my logistics. I need the East stable. I need you in charge. But right now, you are too stupid to be in charge." "Stupid?" David bristled. "I built the East End." "You inherited the East End," Chris corrected. "And you let a snake sleep in your bed because he flattered your ego. You walked into my territory blind, insulted the only person who could save you, and tried to order wine using a dialect you don't understand." Chris closed his book. "You are in a timeout, Mr. Sadler. Use it to think." "I'm not a child." "Then stop acting like one." Chris's voice hardened. "The kitchen is stocked. The bathroom is through the hall. Do not attempt to breach the firewall on the entertainment system. If you do, I will cut the power and you will sit in the dark." "Chris." "Good night, David." The screen went black. David stood in the silence of the penthouse. The rain lashed against the glass. Far below, the city lights blurred. He was trapped, captured by an Omega he had dismissed as a servant, stripped of his power, his men, and his dignity in the span of 30 minutes. David walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. His reflection stared back, angry, disheveled, and for the first time in his life, utterly powerless. He hated Chris Bridge. He hated his calm voice, his superior intellect, his cold eyes. But as he looked at the city he had lost, a darker, colder realization settled in his gut. He was alive only because the shark had decided not to eat him. David slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. He rested his head in his hands. "Checkmate," he whispered into the dark. The fever. 2 days passed in the Velvet Fortress. For David, time became a fluid, maddening concept. He paced. He worked out until his muscles screamed, doing push-ups on the slate floor until sweat pooled beneath him. He shouted at the cameras. He tried to pick the locks on the ventilation shafts, welded shut. Chris gave him nothing. No reaction. Food arrived via a dumbwaiter, a small elevator in the kitchen wall. The meals were high quality, grilled salmon, quinoa, espresso, but the delivery was mechanical. No notes, no face-to-face interaction. David was being starved of the one thing alphas thrived on: conflict and attention. On the second night, the atmosphere changed. David woke up from a restless sleep on the leather sofa. The air in the penthouse felt different, heavier. He sat up, sniffing the air. The filtration system usually scrubbed everything clean, but tonight, a scent was bleeding through the vents. It wasn't a perfume. It was something biological, something primal. It smelled like sea salt, rain on hot pavement, and a sharp, underlying note of distress? No, not distress. It was the scent of an omega entering the cycle. The fever. David stood up, his instincts flaring. His pupils dilated. Even through the filtration, the scent was potent. It triggered the protective instinct in his hindbrain, the drive to find, to claim, to comfort. "Chris," David whispered. He walked to the door, pressing his ear against the steel. The scent was stronger here. "Computer," David said, his voice rough. "Connect me to the control room." Silence. "Chris, answer me." The screen on the wall flickered to life. But it wasn't the clean, well-lit feed of the bar. It was the control room, lit only by the blue glow of monitors. Chris was there, but the composed, icy shark was gone. He was sitting in the command chair, wrapped in a thick blanket. His face was flushed, his hair damp with sweat. His breathing was shallow and fast. He looked physically wrecked, trembling slightly as he typed on the keyboard. The fever had hit him hard. David watched, a twisted sense of victory curling in his chest. Finally, he thought, a weakness. "You look like hell, Ghost," David said to the screen. Chris stopped typing. He turned his head slowly toward the camera lens. His eyes were glassy, fever-bright, but the expression in them halted David's victory lap instantly. There was no softness in that look. No come help me plea. Chris looked like a wounded animal backed into a corner, dangerous, unhinged, and ready to bite the throat out of anything that came close. "Do not," Chris rasped, his voice wrecked. "Speak to me right now." "Nature calling?" David leaned against the wall, trying to project a casual dominance he didn't feel. Usually omegas in your condition prefer company. "I'm right upstairs." It was a low blow, a cheap shot. David knew it. Chris didn't blush. He didn't look away. He leaned into the microphone. "If you think," Chris whispered, "that a biological fluctuation reduces me to a whimpering creature in need of your proximity, you are vastly overestimating your appeal and vastly underestimating my discipline. Biology is biology, Chris. You're burning up. I am running a fever of 102 degrees, Chris said clinically, though a shiver racked his body. My cognitive functions are impaired by 15%. My aggression levels, however, are increased by 200%. Chris's hand moved on the console. I am locking the penthouse down to level 5. The dumbwaiter is sealed. The water is rationed. Do not annoy me, David. I am not in the mood to be benevolent. You're scared, David challenged. You're scared I'll get out and see you like this. Weak. Chris stared at him. The sweat dripped down his temple. I am not scared of you, Chris said. I am scared of what I will do to you if you push me right now. He cut the feed. David stared at the blank screen. The scent of salt and rain lingered, teasing him, taunting him. He walked to the window. The city below was dark. He realized then that Chris hadn't locked the doors to keep David in. He had locked them to keep himself out. And for the first time since he'd been thrown into this glass cage, David didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt like he was sharing the water with something much, much more dangerous than he had realized. The shark was bleeding, but that just meant the water was about to get churned. David sat down by the door, listening to the whir of the locks. Fine, he muttered to the silence. I'll wait. The game had changed, and David Sadler was beginning to realize he didn't want to win anymore. He wanted to understand the player across the board. Part 2, The Velvet Fortress. The frequency of endurance. The air in the penthouse had changed texture. It was no longer empty space. It was a physical weight, heavy and saturated. For David Sadler, the last 48 hours had been a study in psychological erosion. The silence of the apartment was absolute, broken only by the drone of the air filtration system working overtime to scrub the atmosphere. But it wasn't enough. The scent was everywhere. It wasn't the cloying, floral perfume that omegas used to mask their status in high society. It was raw, saline, and electric. It smelled like the moment before a lightning strike. It smelled of fever and biological distress. David paced the length of the living room, his bare feet silent on the cold slate floor. He had done 500 push-ups. He had dismantled and reassembled the coffee maker just to see how it worked. He had watched the rain lash against the reinforced glass until the gray London skyline blurred into a watercolor smear. But his focus always snapped back to the vent in the ceiling. Chris was down there, suffering. David stopped pacing and glared at the speaker system. "You're stubborn," he muttered. "I'll give you that." Most omegas, when the cycle hit, sought comfort. They sought soft nests, heat sources, and the presence of others. It was a biological imperative designed to ensure safety during a time of vulnerability. Chris Bridge did none of those things. He isolated. He froze. He turned his vulnerability into a fortress. David walked to the dumbwaiter. It had been locked for 2 days. No food had come up, which meant Chris hadn't eaten either. "Computer," David barked. "Status report." The automated voice was smooth and genderless. "System status. Lockdown level 5. External communications. Disabled. Internal sensors. Active. Status of the proprietor? Privacy protocols enabled. Medical data is classified." David slammed his hand against the wall. The aggression wasn't just boredom anymore. It was a strange, gnawing anxiety. Alphas were designed to protect the pack, to respond to distress. Being trapped in a glass cage while someone, even an enemy, suffered alone in the basement was scratching at the back of David's brain, agitating his instincts. He hated Chris for trapping him. He hated him for the humiliation in the bar. But he respected the sheer, iron-willed endurance it took to ride out a high-grade fever without suppressants or aid. It was the kind of discipline David demanded from his own lieutenants, and rarely received. Suddenly, the lights flickered. David froze. The low buzz of the filtration system stuttered, died, then whined back to life. Outside, the storm had turned violent. Thunder rattled the heavy glass panes. A bolt of lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the room in a stark, white flash. The lights flickered again, longer this time. Then, darkness. The penthouse plunged into black. "System," David called out. Silence. Then, the red glow of emergency lighting bathed the room in a crimson wash. "Power grid failure," the automated voice droned, sounding slower, distorted. "Switching to auxiliary generators. Rebooting security protocols. Estimated time, 3 minutes." David's eyes adjusted to the red gloom. He looked at the elevator doors. The electronic magnetic seal. For a brief window during the reboot, the magnets would be disengaged. A mandatory fire safety failsafe that even Chris couldn't code out. The mechanical locks would still be in place, but the electronic force holding the doors shut with thousands of pounds of pressure? Gone. David didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy fire poker from the decorative fireplace, a solid bar of iron he'd eyed on his first day. He sprinted to the elevator. He jammed the flat edge of the iron bar into the seam of the steel doors. "Come on," he grunted, bracing his foot against the wall. He pushed. He channeled every ounce of alpha strength, every frustration of the last 3 days, into his shoulders. The metal groaned. A gap appeared. The auxiliary power was trying to kick in, the magnets buzzing as they fought to re-engage. David roared, his muscles straining, veins popping in his neck. With a screech of metal on metal, the doors slid open 18 inches. David didn't wait. He slipped through the gap, dropping into the dark elevator shaft. There was no car. The elevator was on the lower level. He was staring into a black abyss, holding onto the oily cables. He didn't look up. He slid down the central cable, the friction burning his palms even through the calluses. He dropped past the silent residential levels, past the darkened lobby, and down into the building's foundation, landing on top of the elevator car with a heavy thud that shook the shaft. He pried open the maintenance hatch on the roof of the car and dropped inside. The doors to the basement level, the control room, were easier. He forced them open and stepped out. He was out of the tank. The shark in the dark. The basement level was freezing. Unlike the penthouse, which was kept at a neutral temperature, this floor was frigid. It was the heart of the operation, the server room. The air was filled with the deafening drone of cooling fans and the blinking green lights of server racks that held the secrets of half the London underworld. David gripped the iron poker. He moved with the silence of a hunter, stalking through the aisles of servers. He expected guards. He expected Kevin. But the skeleton crew must have been stationed at the perimeter, or perhaps Chris's paranoia ran so deep he allowed no one near him during the cycle. David reached the heavy blast door at the end of the corridor. Command. The electronic lock was dead. The heavy wheel handle, however, was manual. David gripped the wheel and turned. It was heavy, resistant, but it moved. With a groan of steel, the door swung inward. David stepped inside, raising the poker, ready for a fight. The control room was a semicircular space lined with 30 monitors. Most were black due to the power fluctuation, but the emergency backups kept the critical feeds alive. In the center of the room, illuminated by the blue wash of the screens, was the command chair. Chris was there. He wasn't armed. He wasn't posturing. He was curled into a tight ball in the oversized leather chair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. He was shivering so violently that his teeth chattered audibly in the silence. The scent hit David like a physical blow, concentrated, raw, and undeniable. It was the smell of an omega whose biology was tearing him apart, screaming for relief that he refused to take. Chris's head snapped up. He looked wrecked. His skin was pale and sheened with sweat, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes, usually so sharp and cold, were dilated and glassy, fever-bright. But the moment he saw David, the shark surfaced. Chris didn't scream. He didn't beg. He lunged for the console, his hand shaking as he reached for a small, black pistol resting on the desk. David moved faster. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't strike Chris. He simply slammed his hand down on the pistol, pinning it to the desk before Chris's trembling fingers could wrap around the grip. Chris gasped, a ragged, wet sound. He tried to claw at David's hand, but he had no strength. The fever had burned through his energy reserves. He was running on fumes and adrenaline. "Don't," David said, his voice low. Chris slumped back into the chair, his chest heaving. He looked up at David with a mixture of hatred and delirious confusion. "You escaped," Chris rasped. His voice was a ruin. "Your security rebooted," David said, removing the gun and tucking it into his waistband. "You rely too much on machines, Ghost." "Kill me then," Chris whispered. He pulled the blanket tighter around himself, a futile shield. "Do it. Be the wolf." David looked down at him. This was the man who had humiliated him in the restaurant. This was the man who had trapped him. David should be furious. He should be exacting revenge. But looking at Chris now, shivering, defenseless, yet still glaring with that defiant, unbreakable pride, David felt the anger drain away, replaced by something heavier. "I don't kill sick men," David said. "And I don't kill allies." "We are not allies," Chris chattered, his eyes squeezing shut as a wave of heat rolled through him. "We are if you want to keep the East End from burning." David looked away from Chris, scanning the room. He needed to assess the situation. The monitors showed the perimeter cameras. Rain, shadows, nothing moving. Then his eyes landed on a separate screen. It was isolated from the security grid. It wasn't showing a street or a hallway. It was showing a room with white walls. machines that beeped rhythmically, and in the center of the frame, a hospital bed. A child lay in the bed. A boy, maybe 10 years old, connected to a ventilator and in 4-drip. He was sleeping, looking small and fragile amidst the medical technology. David stared at the screen. The boy had Chris's dark hair. "Who is he?" David asked. Chris's eyes snapped open. Panic, real and raw, flooded his face. For the first time, the shark looked terrified. "Don't look at him," Chris hissed, trying to sit up, trying to block David's view. "Don't you dare look at him. Your son." "My brother?" Chris breathed, the fight draining out of him. He slumped back, exhaustion claiming him. "Milo." David pieced it together instantly. The obsession with money, the extreme paranoia, the need for absolute control, the calculated ruthlessness. Chris wasn't building an empire for power. He was building a fortress around that hospital bed. "The best care in Europe," David murmured, recognizing the logo on the boy's blanket. "Zurich? No, Geneva. That costs a fortune." $3 million a year," Chris whispered, his eyes closing. "To keep him stable. The stroke took his mobility. The therapy gives it back." Slowly, David looked at Chris. The ghost wasn't a monster. He was a guardian, a terrified brother standing between the world and a dying boy. "Sullivan knows," Chris mumbled, his speech slurring as the delirium pulled him under. "Sullivan found out about the clinic. He threatened to freeze the funding for the clinic. That's why I couldn't let him take the East." The revelation hit David like a physical punch. Sullivan hadn't just betrayed David. He had threatened a child to get to Chris. "That's why you saved me," David realized. "You needed the East stable so Sullivan couldn't leverage the boy." Chris didn't answer. His breathing had hitched. The shivering stopped, replaced by a stillness that was worse. He was burning up. David reached out, touching the back of his hand to Chris's forehead. The heat was radiating off him like a furnace. "You're cooking your brain, Chris," David muttered. "Where are your suppressants?" "Out," Chris breathed. "Shipment delayed." "Storm," David cursed. He looked around the room. In the corner, there was a small sink and a mini-fridge. He didn't think. He acted. He went to the sink, found a clean towel and soaked it in cold water. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. He returned to the chair. "Drink." Chris turned his head away. "No. Poison. If I wanted to poison you, I'd just let you die of dehydration," David snapped. He cracked the seal so Chris could hear the click. "Drink. That's an order." Chris hesitated, then opened his mouth. David held the bottle to his lips, letting him sip slowly. When he was done, David placed the cold, wet towel on Chris's forehead. Chris let out a long, shuddering sigh as the cold touched his skin. His eyes fluttered open, focusing on David with a hazy confusion. "Why?" Chris whispered. David pulled up a spare rolling chair and sat down, placing the fire poker on the desk within easy reach. He faced the door, his back to Chris. "Because Sullivan threatened a kid," David said, his voice hard. "And where I come from, that makes him a dead man walking." David crossed his arms, staring at the heavy steel door. "Sleep, ghost. I've got the door." Chris watched the broad back of the Alpha. The man he had humiliated. The man he had imprisoned. David wasn't trying to touch him. He wasn't trying to leverage the situation. He was sitting guard. He had placed himself between the shark and the dark. Chris's eyes grew heavy. The scent of the Alpha, gunpowder, rain, and now protection, filled the room, overpowering the smell of his own distress. For the first time in 4 days, Chris let go. "David," he whispered. "Yeah. Don't break anything else." David smirked in the darkness. "Go to sleep. The breakfast of kings." The fever broke 23 hours later. Chris woke up to the smell of coffee. Real coffee. Not the automated pod sludge, but something brewed. He blinked, his body feeling heavy and sore, as if he had run a marathon. But the heat was gone. The haze in his mind had cleared, leaving behind the sharp, crystalline focus that was his trademark. He sat up slowly. The wool blanket slid down his chest. He was still in the command chair. David was sitting on the desk, legs crossed at the ankles. He was reading a file, one of Chris's classified files. "You're violating about 7 privacy laws right now," Chris rasped. His voice was scratchy, but steady. David didn't look up. "And you violated about 7 kidnapping laws. Let's call it even." David reached behind him and picked up a steaming mug. He held it out. "Black. 2 sugars. Assuming your taste is as bitter as your personality." Chris stared at the mug, then at David. The alpha looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and stubble darkened his jaw. He clearly hadn't slept. He had stood vigil the entire time. Chris took the mug. His fingers brushed David's. The contact was brief, electric, but neither man pulled away instantly. "Thank you," Chris said. It was the hardest thing he had ever said. "Don't mention it." David hopped off the desk. "Status report. The storm passed. Power is back to 100%. Your security grid is green. Kevin called down 3 times. I told him you were busy executing me and didn't want to be disturbed." Chris took a sip of the coffee. "It was perfect. You improvised. I managed." Chris looked at the screen where Milo's monitor had been. It was black now. "I turned it off," David said quietly. "Before you woke up. Figured you wouldn't want me staring." Chris gripped the mug tighter. "You saw. I saw. If you use him against me, I don't leverage kids, Chris." David cut him off, his voice sharp. "I'm a criminal, not a monster. There's a difference. Sullivan crossed that line. I don't." Chris studied him. He looked for the lie. He looked for the deceit that he found in every other alpha he had ever met. He found none. He saw only a tired wolf who was angry on his behalf. "Sullivan," Chris said, shifting gears instantly. "He knows I'm vulnerable right now. He thinks I'm deep in the cycle. He thinks you're dead. This is his window. He'll hit the Obsidian tonight," David agreed. "He'll want to take the throne while it's empty." "I checked the logs the moment I woke up," Chris said, his eyes hard on the screen. "Sullivan never had eyes on the clinic. The footage he showed me was bought from a hacker. Milo is safe. Now we just have to survive the night. He won't come alone. He'll bring the North." "Then we have a problem," David said. "Because your security is good, but it's designed to keep people out. It's not designed for a siege against heavy artillery." Chris stood up. His legs were shaky, but he forced them to hold his weight. He walked to the main console and typed in a sequence. A map of London appeared on the main screen. Red dots pulsed in the East End. Blue dots in the West. "My men are loyal," Chris said. "But they aren't soldiers. They're security. Sullivan has hitters. Mercenaries." "I have soldiers," David said. Chris looked at him. "The men I bought from you are guarding the lobby. But 6 bodyguards won't stop an army." "Raki is just the hired help," David corrected. "My loyalists, the ones Sullivan didn't know about, the ones I keep in reserve, they're waiting for a signal." "A signal? A dead man's switch. If I don't check in every 72 hours, they assume the worst and they scorch the earth." David checked his non-existent watch. "I'm at hour 71. Chris's mind raced. He calculated the variables, the probabilities. "If you call them," Chris said slowly, "they will come here." "Yes. And if they come here, they will see that I am holding their Don captive." "Yes. So, once Sullivan is dealt with, they will turn on me." David held Chris's gaze. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unsaid things. "That depends," David said softly. "On what?" "On whether I tell them I'm a captive or a partner." Chris lowered the coffee mug. The word hung in the air. Partner. It was a dangerous word. In their world, partnerships were usually preludes to betrayal. But after the last 24 hours, after the fever, the water, the silence in the dark, something had shifted. Chris had shown his throat, his brother. David had shown his teeth, his escape, but hadn't bitten. A partnership, Chris tested the word. The shark and the wolf. The east and the west, David corrected. United, we take Sullivan out. We secure your brother's clinic. We stabilize the city. And then, David stepped closer, invading Chris's personal space. But this time it wasn't to intimidate. It was to bridge the gap. And then you owe me a dinner, where the waiter doesn't speak in riddles and the wine doesn't come with a lecture. Chris felt a ghost of a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. It was a foreign sensation. I can't promise the lecture, Chris said. I have standards. David chuckled. It was a warm, rough sound. I can work with standards. David held out his hand. Phone, David said. I need to make a call. It was the ultimate test. If Chris gave him the phone, he was giving David command of an army inside his own fortress. He was handing over the keys to his survival. Chris looked at David's hand. He looked at the scars on his knuckles. He thought of the cold towel on his forehead. Chris reached into his pocket and pulled out his own encrypted satellite phone. He unlocked it. He placed it in David's hand. Make it count, Chris said. David flipped the phone open. He didn't look away from Chris. Bishop, David said into the phone, his voice dropping into the command tone of a dawn. It's David. Initiate Protocol 0. Override the 72-hour timer. We aren't waiting for the deadline. Mobilize now. We're at the Obsidian. And Bishop. David paused, his eyes locked on Chris's blue ones. The Westside is friendly. I repeat, the Westside is friendly. We are fighting with the ghost, not against him. David hung up. They're 10 minutes out, David said. Chris nodded. He turned to the wall of weapons lockers hidden behind a panel. He keyed it open. Assault rifles, tactical vests, and handguns gleamed in the light. Chris tossed a heavy tactical vest to David. Put it on, Chris said, pulling one on himself over his wrinkled shirt. If you die on my floor, the paperwork will be excruciating. David caught the vest. He grinned. A sharp, dangerous baring of teeth. Don't worry, sunshine, David said, checking the chamber of a heavy assault rifle he pulled from the rack. I'm just getting started. Chris leaned against the weapons rack, his hand trembling as the adrenaline spiked. The ghost of the fever was still heavy in his blood, making the room spin at the edges of his vision. He grabbed a distinctively labeled injector from a refrigerated lockbox. It wasn't a standard suppressant. It was a military-grade combat stimulant. He jammed it into his thigh with a grimace. That buys me 2 hours of stamina, Chris exhaled, the tremor in his hands stilling. After that, I collapse. David watched him, eyes dark. 2 hours is all we need. The siege begins. They stood in the elevator rising toward the lobby. The dynamic had shifted. They weren't enemies. They weren't quite friends. They were two apex predators who had realized that hunting together yielded better results than hunting each other. Chris adjusted his cuffs. He felt the residual ache of the fever, but the adrenaline was masking it. One question, Chris said as the floor numbers ticked up. Yeah. When you broke into the control room, you had the element of surprise. You could have knocked me out, taken the system. Why didn't you? David looked at the metal doors. I told you, David said. I saw the screens. I saw what you were fighting for. He glanced at Chris. And I realized you weren't a soulless machine. You were just a man drowning in a tank of his own making. The elevator dinged. And? Chris asked softly. And? David shrugged, stepping out as the doors opened into the chaos of the lobby, where Kevin was shouting orders. I figured you could use a lifeguard. Chris watched him walk into the fray, barking orders at the Westside security as if he had always commanded them. For the first time in years, Chris Bridge didn't feel alone in the tank. He checked his weapon, smoothed his expression into the mask of the ghost, and followed the wolf into the war. Part 3, the Checkmate and the Bond. The killing floor. The Obsidian Room was no longer a place of silent luxury. It was a kill box. The elevator doors pinged softly, a jarringly cheerful sound against the backdrop of distant, muffled explosions coming from the street-level entrance. Chris Bridge stepped out first. He moved differently now. The sommelier's apron was gone, replaced by the tactical vest over his dress shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were deceptively slender but wired with tension. He didn't hold his weapon like a gangster. He held it like an instrument. David Sadler followed, a hulking shadow at his shoulder. The alpha presence was massive, filling the corridor, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. It was a shield wall. Status? Chris murmured into his comms. They've breached the outer blast doors. Kevin's voice crackled, tense but controlled. Sullivan brought heavy breaching charges. We're holding the foyer, but they have numbers. 20, maybe 30 hostiles. Mercenaries from the north. Let them in, Chris said. David glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. Let them in. The foyer is a choke point, Chris explained, walking briskly toward the main bar area. If we fight them at the door, they can use cover. If we let them into the main lounge, they enter the kill zone. Open the secondary shutters, Kevin. Bait the trap. David grinned, a sharp, predatory expression. You're a cold bastard, Ghost. I'm efficient, Chris corrected. Take the left flank. Use the marble pillars. I'll take the high ground on the mezzanine. You're not fighting on the floor. I am the architect, David. I don't lay bricks. I drop the wall. David chuckled, checking the magazine of his rifle. Fine. I'll be the hammer. You be the anvil. They split. The movement was fluid, unspoken. There was no hesitation, no be careful whispers. They were two professionals clocking in for a shift. David vaulted over the mahogany bar, positioning himself behind the reinforced wood. He signaled to 3 of Chris's security guards, men who looked terrified to see the dead, Don alive and armed, to hold the right side. Listen up, David barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic. Sullivan is walking through that door expecting a funeral. We're gonna give him a war. Controlled fire. Watch your cross lanes. Nobody dies today unless I give you permission. Clear? Clear! The men shouted back, their spines stiffening. They weren't fighting for a paycheck anymore. They were fighting for a warlord. Above them, on the shadowed balcony of the mezzanine, Chris knelt behind the glass railing. He opened his laptop, connecting it to the building's internal rig. The lights in the main room flickered and died. Total darkness swallowed the Obsidian Room. Kevin, Chris whispered. Now. At the far end of the room, the heavy blast doors groaned and retracted. A shout went up from the attackers outside. They're retreating. Push. Push now. Footsteps thundered against the expensive tile. Flashlight beams cut through the smoky air, chaotic and searching. The mercenaries poured in, confident, loud, assuming the blackout was a sign of surrender. Sullivan's voice echoed from the rear. Find the Omega, drag him out, and burn the rest. David, crouched in the dark behind the bar, felt a low growl vibrate in his chest. The Omega. Sullivan spoke the word like a slur, like Chris was something to be collected. David waited. He could hear their breathing. He could smell the cheap gun oil and the sweat of men who thought they had already won. Above, Chris watched the thermal feeds on his screen. 32 heat signatures. They were all in the center of the room. The kill zone. Chris tapped a key. Clang. The blast doors slammed shut behind the mercenaries, sealing them in. Simultaneously, the acoustic panels on the walls, usually designed to dampen sound, reversed polarity. High-frequency emitters hidden in the architecture shrieked to life. It wasn't loud enough to cause permanent damage, but it was a disorienting, nausea-inducing whine that scrambled equilibrium. The mercenaries staggered, hands flying to their ears, flashlight beams swinging wildly. Now, Chris said into the comms. David stood up from behind the bar. He didn't fire immediately. He let them see him. He let the beam of a tactical light hit his face. Evening, boys, David boomed. The mercenaries froze. The ghost of David Sadler stood before them, very much alive, and very pissed off. "David?" one of them stammered. "But Sullivan said." "Sullivan lied," David said. He raised his rifle. "Light them up." The room erupted. 2. The symphony of violence. The firefight was brutal, short, and loud. David moved with the brutal efficiency of a wolf in a sheep pen. He fired, moved, fired again. He was a kinetic force, drawing the enemy's fire, shouting orders, keeping the mercenaries pinned down behind the flimsy, overturned tables. But every time a mercenary tried to flank David, a single, precise shot rang out from the darkness of the mezzanine. Crack. A man dropped. Crack. Another weapon skittered across the floor. Chris wasn't spraying bullets. He was surgical. He was picking them off one by one, covering David's blind spots with a terrifying calm. David felt a rush he hadn't experienced in years. Usually, he had to protect his partners. He had to worry about them. With Chris, he didn't have to look back. He knew with absolute certainty that his 6 was clear because the shark was watching. It was an intoxicating rhythm. The Alpha commanded the ground. The Omega controlled the environment. When a group of 5 mercenaries tried to rush the bar, Chris didn't just shoot. He hacked the fire suppression system. A curtain of halon gas dumped directly onto the charging group, blinding them and sucking the oxygen from their immediate vicinity. They collapsed, coughing and gasping. David vaulted the bar, knocking 2 of them out with the stock of his rifle before they could recover. "Show off!" David yelled up at the balcony. "Effective!" Chris's voice came back over the comms, dry and cool. Within 10 minutes, the room fell silent. The mercenaries were either unconscious, zip-tied, or groaning on the floor. The air smelled of cordite, halon, and victory. David stood in the center of the room, breathing hard, sweat trickling down his temple. He did a quick head count. His team was battered, but alive. "Clear," David said. "Not yet." Chris's voice came from the speakers. "Sullivan wasn't in the first wave. He's in the foyer." The main blast doors hissed. David turned, leveling his weapon. The doors opened slowly. Sullivan walked in. He wasn't alone. He had Kevin, Chris's head of security, in a chokehold, a gun pressed to the man's temple. Kevin was bleeding from a nasty gash on his forehead, his arm hanging limp. Sullivan looked frantic. His plan had collapsed. His army was broken, but he still had a hostage. "Back off!" Sullivan screamed, his voice cracking. "Back the fuck off or I paint the wall with him." David held his fire. He signaled his men to lower their weapons. Sullivan dragged Kevin into the room, his eyes darting around the carnage. When he saw David, his face twisted into a mask of pure hate. "You," Sullivan spat, "you're supposed to be dead. You're supposed to be a corpse in a ditch. Disappointing, isn't it?" David stepped forward slowly, hands raised to show he wasn't firing. "You always did underestimate me, Sullivan. That's why you were always the lieutenant, never the Don." "I took the money," Sullivan yelled. "The North offered me double what you pay. I did what was smart." "You betrayed the family," David said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "For paper. And you," Sullivan sneered. "Look at you. Protecting him? Protecting an Omega?" Sullivan laughed, a manic, high-pitched sound. "Did he scent you, David? Did he wrap you around his little finger? You're pathetic. You're guarding a liability who thinks he's a businessman." David didn't flinch. But the air around him grew heavy, the pressure spiking. "He's not a whore, Sullivan," David said softly. "And he's not a businessman. Then what is he?" "He's the guy pointing a sniper rifle at your left eye right now." Sullivan froze. He tried to hide behind Kevin, shrinking his profile. "Bullshit," Sullivan hissed. "I can't see him." "That's the point," David said. "He's the ghost. Remember, if he takes the shot, I pull the trigger." Sullivan screamed, pressing the gun harder into Kevin's temple. "I kill your man." "Kevin isn't my man," David said calmly. "He's Chris's." From the darkness of the mezzanine, Chris's voice amplified through the room's speakers. It was godlike, echoing from everywhere at once. "Releasing the hostage is your only option, Sullivan. Come down here and face me," Sullivan shouted at the ceiling. "Come down here, you coward." "I don't negotiate with staff," Chris replied. Sullivan roared in frustration. "I'll kill him. I swear to God." "David," Chris said. "Protocol 7. David grinned. "Understood." Sullivan blinked. What is Protocol 7? David didn't answer. He dropped his rifle, clattered loudly on the floor. Sullivan's eyes instinctively followed the noise. It was a fraction of a second, a reflex. In that microsecond of distraction, Kevin, who knew exactly what Protocol 7 was, dropped his dead weight. He didn't try to break his fall with his bad arm. He simply surrendered to gravity. The sudden, jarring weight dragged Sullivan's gun arm down with him. The shot didn't come from David. It came from the balcony. The bullet struck Sullivan's hand, blowing the pistol apart and shattering his fingers. Sullivan screamed, staggering back, clutching his mangled hand. David moved. He covered the 20 feet between them in a blur of motion. He didn't use a weapon. He used his fist. A solid, devastating right hook that connected with Sullivan's jaw with the sound of cracking bone. Sullivan hit the floor and didn't move. David stood over him, chest heaving. He looked at Kevin, who was groaning and pushing himself up. "You good?" David asked. Kevin wiped blood from his eye. "Protocol 7 sucks. My knees hurt. Better than your head exploding." David looked up at the balcony. Chris stepped out of the shadows. He holstered his sniper rifle and leaned over the railing. He looked down at the unconscious body of Sullivan, then at David. Their eyes met across the devastation of the room. There was no victory cheer, no hug, just a long, silent acknowledgement. "Clean this up," Chris ordered his men, his voice steady. "And someone get me a drink." The decompression. The aftermath of violence is always quiet. An hour later, the police on Chris's payroll had come and gone, taking the mercenaries away in unmarked vans. A gas leak was the official story for the noise. David sat on the edge of the bar, a bag of ice pressed to his knuckles. He had refused medical attention for the few scrapes he'd taken. Chris walked in. He had changed. The tactical vest was gone, replaced by a fresh, crisp white shirt, though he hadn't bothered with a tie. He looked tired. The adrenaline of the siege and the lingering effects of the fever were catching up to him. He carried 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to David and leaned against the bar next to him. Not facing him, but shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the empty room where staff were already scrubbing the floor. "Your brother," David said, breaking the silence. "The clinic." "Secure," Chris said, taking a sip. "My contact in Geneva confirmed it. Sullivan never had anyone there. It was a bluff. He bought the surveillance footage, but he never had boots on the ground." David exhaled, a tension he hadn't realized he was holding releasing from his shoulders. "Good. Thank you," Chris said softly, "for the vest. And for the restraint." "I wanted to kill him," David admitted. "When he called you that, he was trying to provoke you. Words are wind, David. Not those words." David turned his head, looking at Chris's profile. "You were terrifying up there. The lights, the gas. I've never seen anyone weaponize a building before." Chris smirked, swirling his drink. "I told you, I prefer to control the environment." "You're not a shark," David mused. "Sharks just bite. You're something else. A monster. A mastermind." Chris turned to face him. The blue eyes were guarded, searching. "So," Chris said, "Sullivan is in custody. The East is leaderless. Your dead man's switch army is parked outside. Technically, this is the part where you double-cross me. You have the numbers. You could take the Obsidian right now." It was the lingering paranoia, the scar tissue of a life lived looking over his shoulder. David set his glass down. He stood up, turning fully toward Chris. He was larger, broader, radiating the heat of an alpha, but he kept his posture open. No threat. I could, David said. I could take this place. I could burn your network. I could go back to being the king of the East and pretending the West doesn't exist. But I'd be bored, David said honestly. And I'd be alone. David took a step closer. He reached out. Chris flinched just a fraction of an inch, a reflex. But he didn't pull away. David didn't go for his neck. He didn't try to mark him. He didn't grab his waist. David took Chris's right hand. He lifted it. The fingers were long, elegant, calloused from the rifle grip. Slowly, deliberately, David lowered his head. He pressed his forehead against Chris's knuckles. It was a gesture of immense weight. In the underworld code, it wasn't submission. It was fealty. It was an acknowledgement of equal standing, of profound respect. It was the knight bowing to the sovereign. I don't want the obsidian, David murmured against Chris's skin. And I don't want a passive omega to warm my bed. I tried that. It's empty. He pulled back, looking Chris in the eye. I want the partner who guards my door when the lights go out. I want the mind that can checkmate me in 3 moves. I want the shark. Chris stared at him. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from a sudden, terrifying realization. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just the ghost. He was seen. You are proposing an alliance, Chris said, his voice breathless. I'm proposing a merger, David corrected, a small smile playing on his lips. Hostile takeovers are messy. I prefer joint ventures. Chris looked at David's hand holding his. He felt the connection, not a magical, pheromone-driven bond, but something forged in fire and survival. A shared rhythm. A merger, Chris repeated. The terms would have to be extensive. I have good lawyers. 50/50th split on all territory north of the river? Agreed. Absolute transparency on finances? Done. And Chris narrowed his eyes, the negotiator surfacing. If you ever use Cockney rhyming slang in my presence again, I will shoot you myself. David threw his head back and laughed, a loud, genuine sound that chased the last shadows from the room. Deal. Epilogue. The Shark and the Wolf. 6 months later. The glass home. The penthouse, once a sterile glass cage, now looked like something else entirely. It looked lived in. It was 7 p.m. on a Saturday. Rain streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Obsidian Tower, blurring the lights of London into a kaleidoscope of gray and gold. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of cedar, expensive cologne, and the faint, savory aroma of the dinner that had just been finished. Chris stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting his midnight blue velvet tuxedo. He was frowning at his bow tie. His hands, usually steady enough to strip a sniper rifle in the dark, were fumbling. Stop fighting it, a voice rumbled from the doorway. The fabric can smell fear. Chris watched in the mirror as David approached. The alpha was already dressed in black, his tuxedo cut to accommodate the broad width of his shoulders. 6 months of partnership had changed David. The perpetual tension in his jaw was gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering confidence. He didn't look like a brawler anymore. He looked like a king. David stepped up behind Chris. He didn't touch him immediately. He let his presence settle first, a warm, solid weight against Chris's back. I'm not fighting it, Chris murmured, dropping his hands. I'm negotiating with it. Let me. David's large hands moved to Chris's neck. His fingers were gentle, brushing against the sensitive skin of Chris's profile, a gesture that would have made the old Chris flinch. Now Chris leaned into it. He tilted his head back, exposing his neck, an act of supreme trust. David tied the bow with practiced ease, but he didn't pull away when he was done. He rested his hands on Chris's shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of his collarbone. You look dangerous, David murmured, his voice low and vibrating against Chris's spine. Blue velvet. You're baiting them. I'm the ghost, David. I have to look the part. You're not a ghost anymore, David corrected, meeting Chris's eyes in the reflection. "You're very real. And you're mine." It wasn't a claim of ownership like property. It was a statement of gravity. "I am the planet, you are the moon. We are locked. And you are sentimental," Chris teased, though his pulse quickened. A loud crash from the living room shattered the moment. "Damn it!" a young voice yelled, followed by the sound of plastic shattering against the slate floor. Chris and David exchanged a look, not of alarm, but of amused resignation. They walked into the living area. The sleek, minimalist furniture had been pushed to the walls. The center of the room was dominated by a sprawling, chaotic construction site of gray plastic bricks. Milo, now looking healthier, with color in his cheeks and his wheelchair pushed to the side, was sitting on the floor surrounded by the wreckage of what appeared to be a Star Destroyer. It collapsed. Milo groaned, looking up at them. Structural failure on the bridge. David sighed, but there was a smile tugging at his lips. He walked over, crouching down in his expensive tuxedo pants without a second thought. He picked up a chunk of the Lego ship. "I told you, kid," David said, inspecting the damage. "You rushed the foundation. You can't build the bridge until the hull is reinforced. It's like running an empire. If the basement is weak, the penthouse falls." "You're turning my brother into a mobster," Chris noted dryly, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm turning him into an engineer," David countered. He ruffled Milo's hair. "Leave it for tonight. When we get back, we fix the hull. Deal?" Milo grinned. "Deal. But you have to do the tedious gray parts." "Fine. But I'm charging you by the hour." David stood up and walked back to Chris. The domesticity of the moment struck Chris with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the nights he spent alone in this room, watching the monitors, terrified for Milo, terrified of the world. Now there was laughter. There was a wolf on the floor discussing structural engineering. There was safety. David offered his arm. "Ready to go scare some politicians?" Chris took it. "Always. The New World Order." The charity gala at the Tate Modern was the highlight of the London social season. Politicians, celebrities, and billionaires mingled under the towering industrial architecture, sipping champagne and pretending they weren't all sharks in tuxedos. The room quieted as the doors opened. Chris Bridge entered. He wore the midnight blue velvet, sharp and tailored to perfection. He walked with a confidence that made people step aside instinctively. Beside him walked David Sadler. The Alpha wore black, his hand resting possessively, but protectively, on the small of Chris's back. They moved as one entity, a shared gravity. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew the rumors. The East and West had united. The gang war had ended overnight, replaced by a monolithic syndicate that controlled everything from the docks to the banking sector. "They say he runs the whole thing," a socialite whispered behind her fan. "The Omega. They say the Alpha kills anyone who looks at him wrong," her husband muttered. David leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of Chris's ear. "They're terrified of us." "They should be," Chris replied, scanning the room coolly. "I see 3 members of Parliament who owe us favors, and the banking regulator who tried to freeze my accounts last year." "Boring," David groaned, his breath warm against Chris's neck. "Can't we just intimidate someone and leave? I promised Milo I'd help him with that Lego Star Destroyer tonight. The structural integrity is keeping me up at night." Chris smiled. It was a real smile, soft and genuine, the kind the public never saw. "1 hour," Chris negotiated. "We shake hands, we remind the Minister of Trade about his gambling debts, and then we go home." "Fine," David grumbled, tightening his grip on Chris's waist slightly. "But you owe me." "I always pay my debts, Mr. Sadler." They reached the center of the room. A waiter approached with a tray of wine. David stopped him. He picked up a glass of red, inspected the label, and grimaced. 2021 Cabernet, David scoffed, swirling the liquid with disdain. "Barely drinkable." He looked at Chris, his eyes dancing with a private joke that only they understood. "What would you say, Sommelier? An uninspired vintage for a pedestrian crowd?" Chris took the glass from David's hand. His fingers brushed against David's, a spark of contact that felt like a secret language. He took a sip, his eyes locking with the alphas. I would say, Chris murmured, that taste is subjective. But quality is undeniable. He handed the glass back to the waiter without looking away from David. And we, Chris said, stepping closer until their chests nearly touched. Our top shelf. David laughed, a low, rumbling sound that made the nearby guests nervously check their jewelry. He pulled Chris closer into his side. The scent of them together, sea salt and gunpowder, rain and iron, filled the space around them. It wasn't a scent of biology or dominance. It was the scent of absolute power. They walked into the crowd, the shark and the wolf, perfectly aligned, ready to eat the world alive. The drive home, they lasted 45 minutes. They left the Minister of Trade pale and sweating near the hors d'oeuvres, and slipped out the side exit before the speeches began. The back of the armored Maybach was quiet and dark, insulated from the London rain. The privacy partition was up. Chris leaned his head back against the leather seat, closing his eyes. We didn't stay for the auction. I'll send a check, David said, loosening his tie. Besides, I already have the only thing in that room worth owning. Chris opened his eyes and turned his head. David was watching him. In the shadows of the car, the alpha's gaze wasn't predatory. It was reverent. David reached into his jacket pocket. I got you something, since we skipped the gift bag. He pulled out a small velvet box. Chris sat up straighter. David, we agreed. No jewelry. It's two. It's not a ring, David said. He opened the box. Inside lay a pair of cufflinks. They were custom-made, obsidian stone, cut into the sharp, angular shape of a shark's tooth, encased in white gold. For the shark, David said softly. So you never forget who runs the tank. Chris took the box. His throat felt tight. It was a nod to their beginning, to the BL story of us, the moment David had realized exactly who Chris was. Help me put them on? Chris asked, his voice quiet. David nodded. He reached over, unfastening the standard buttons on Chris's cuffs and sliding the obsidian teeth into place. His movements were slow, deliberate. When he finished, he didn't let go of Chris's wrists. He turned them over, pressing a kiss to the palm of Chris's left wrist, then the right. You know, David murmured against his skin. Everyone thinks I tamed you. Chris huffed a soft laugh. Let them think it. It makes them underestimate me. I know the truth, though. David looked up, his eyes dark and intense. I didn't tame the shark. I just learned how to swim in deep water. Chris freed one hand to cup David's jaw, his thumb brushing over the rough stubble. You didn't just learn to swim, David, Chris whispered. You became the anchor. If I am the deep water, you are the only thing keeping me from drifting away. David leaned into the touch, closing his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, the playful banter was gone, replaced by raw honesty. Then we stay right here, David said, in the deep end, together. Chris leaned forward, closing the distance. He kissed David, slow, deep, and tasting of expensive wine and rain. It wasn't a kiss of hunger, but of certainty. The car turned the corner, the lights of the Obsidian Tower coming into view, their fortress, their home. Home, Chris whispered against David's lips. Home, David agreed. Now come on. We have a Star Destroyer to fix.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please show some love by liking and subscribing. Your support truly helps the channel grow. I would love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. Until next time.